My name is Harold Mercer. I'm 72 years old. Been a mechanic for most of my life. Hands always stained, back always sore, but proud of every callus. I've got a house that creaks like I do, a wife who still makes coffee like it's a ritual, and a son who used to sit on my shoulders to watch fireworks. But people change. And sometimes, the ones you raise turn into strangers behind familiar eyes. Sit back and let me tell you how everything I built was stolen in silence, and how I made sure the silence screamed back. Before we get too far, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak in the hallway made me flinch. Every shadow that passed the crack under the door sent my heart racing. It was strange, being afraid in my own home. But it wasn't fear of violence. It was fear of what came next, of pretending everything was fine when I knew the truth. Ellen stirred beside me, her hand finding mine under the blanket. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I meant it, just thinking. About? I paused. About trust, about how quickly it can disappear. She didn't ask more. Maybe she knew better. Or maybe she already suspected something I hadn't said out loud. The next morning, we had visitors. Jacob showed up with a bag of oranges, and that same forced cheer he always wore. "How's my old man?" he said, clapping his hands and leaning in for a kiss on his mother's cheek. I watched him like a hawk, smiled when I had to, nodded, said thank you. Even thanked him for checking in while I was in the hospital. I let him talk. Let him sit in the chair across from me. Let him sip the coffee Ellen made and tell us about his job, his stress, the real estate market. It was like nothing had happened. He didn't flinch, didn't stutter. He looked me in the eye with the same fake warmth he used on his clients, and all I could think was, "You're good, too good." He stayed, half an hour. Gave me a hug on the way out and said, "If you need anything, I'm always around." I nodded. "Same to you." The moment the door shut, I turned to Ellen. "I need to show you something," I said. We sat together on the couch. I opened my laptop and loaded the footage. The living room camera, the hallway, the study, the safe. I didn't watch her face. I watched the screen. I watched my son lean over, whisper something to himself, then pull the handle open like he'd done it 100 times before. No hesitation, no guilt, just precision. Ellen gasped softly. Her hand gripped my arm. "Howard." "I know. He took everything." I finally looked at her. He didn't just take the money, he took the last thing I thought was safe. We sat in silence. Then she said quietly, "What are you going to do?" I stood up, walked over to the desk, opened the drawer, pulled out a folder and handed it to her. She opened it slowly. Inside were copies of the will, the trust documents, the property titles, bank statements, and a USB drive with every recording from every camera in the house. "I'm not rushing this," I said, "but I want you to know this ends with me taking back everything." She didn't say a word, just looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. That night I stayed up again, not in fear, but in planning. The morning after, I opened the shed. It's where I kept the things most people would throw away: scrap bolts, faded manuals, rusted tools that had long outlived their usefulness. But tucked beneath a false bottom in the cabinet, behind an old can of carb cleaner, was the box. A plain plastic container, nothing flashy. Inside, the first camera I'd ever installed, a basic motion sensor model. I'd bought it years ago when a neighbor's house got broken into, and Ellen couldn't sleep for a week. I had told her it was just for peace of mind. What I didn't tell her was that I'd never uninstalled it, and over the years I added more, subtle ones, some wired, some battery-operated. One hidden in the corner of the bookshelf, another behind a vent, all of them connected to a backup hard drive in the attic, running through an old laptop no one ever used. Just in case. Just in case became reality. I took the drive out and brought it inside. Ellen watched me the whole time, not with suspicion, with concern. like she was seeing the weight I carried but didn't know how to lift it. "I didn't know you'd kept all those," she said. "I didn't either, not really. Not until now." I plugged in the drive and pulled up the timeline. There he was, Jacob, marching through the door the day after I fell. No hesitation. He went straight for the study, knew the exact drawer with the spare safe key, knew the combination too, even though I changed it last year. He must have seen me enter it at some point, stored it away like a predator watching its prey. Ellen clutched the blanket tighter around her lap. He didn't even look nervous. I stared at the screen. He knew we'd be gone, probably even knew how long I'd be in the hospital. He planned this. Her voice cracked. "Why would he?" "Because he doesn't see us as people anymore," I said coldly. "We're just obstacles, locks to pick, doors to open, safes to crack." She didn't reply. Neither did I. That week, I began drafting. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been through enough to know how to make things airtight. I called my old friend Marty, who used to do estate work before retiring. He owed me a few favors from back when I rebuilt his Impala's transmission for half price. We met at a diner outside town. I handed him a folder. "Harold," he said, flipping through the pages, "this is thorough." "It has to be." He paused at the trust agreement. "You're moving everything out of your name?" "Yes." He gave me a long look. "That's extreme." I nodded. "So was watching your son rob you," with a smile. He didn't ask more questions, just slid the folder back into his briefcase. "I'll get this finalized, but you need to understand. Once you do this, there's no going back. You'll need to appoint a third party for oversight, no beneficiary access until you pass." "I know." He glanced out the window. "And the house?" "Transferring that too, to the same trust, but with a final clause." He raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "That the trust converts into a non-profit foundation 1 year after my death, named after Ellen and me. Its sole purpose, to fund apprenticeship programs for young mechanics, kids with no fathers, the kind who need someone to believe in them." Marty smiled. "You always were a stubborn old bastard." I sipped my coffee, and I planned to die that way. When I came home, Ellen was at the window watching the leaves scatter across the yard. "Everything okay?" she asked. "It will be," I said. "Soon." We didn't talk about Jacob for days. Didn't need to. His silence was louder than any apology. But I wasn't rushing this. No screaming. No confrontations. Just paperwork, cameras, patience. The kind of patience you learn after 40 years of fixing broken machines. You wait, you assess, you find the weak point. And when the time is right, you make your move. Jacob had no idea he'd already triggered it. The days after that felt slow, almost syrupy. Every motion in the house was deliberate, like Ellen and I had both stepped into a world that moved just a little differently. She didn't ask questions, not because she didn't have them, but because she trusted I wasn't acting out of pride or anger. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a reckoning. I started walking again, slow at first, but steady. Every morning I'd go out to the garage and sit for a while, letting the smell of old grease and rusted tools pull me back to who I used to be. The pegboard was still lined with wrenches, some of them older than Jacob. I kept one in my hand sometimes while I thought, feeling the weight of it, the familiar calluses it once deepened. It helped me focus. Jacob didn't come around again that week. I didn't expect him to. In fact, I was counting on it. The kind of man who can lie with his whole face doesn't visit out of guilt. He visits when it benefits him. That gave me time. First thing I did was pull every camera feed off the cloud and store it on 3 separate encrypted drives, one in my office drawer, one in the garage under a fake oil can, one I mailed to a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. You don't survive betrayal by trusting the systems that failed you. Next, I made calls. Not to banks, not to lawyers. That would come later. First, I needed to understand the rules of the game Jacob was playing. I knew he'd already moved some of the money, probably into crypto or stocks. He was always talking about leverage and making your money work for you like he was some kind of expert. He wasn't. But he was dangerous enough to be stupid with other people's futures. I talked to a contact of mine, Alan Kessler. Used to be a private investigator. Now worked as a data analyst for hire. Quiet guy but sharp. I sent him the footage. Told him I didn't want action, just patterns. I want to know where the money went. Who he's working with. What he thinks. I don't know. Alan didn't ask why. He just said, "Give me 4 days." Perfect. In those 4 days, Ellen and I rebuilt our rhythm. I started fixing things around the house. Door hinges, loose tiles, the squeaky stair. She made meals like she was feeding something deeper than just hunger. One night, as we ate in front of the fire, she finally broke the silence. "Are you going to confront him?" I sipped my tea. "Eventually." "What will you say?" "Nothing." She looked at me. "Nothing?" "He won't hear words. He only hears results." Ellen nodded slowly as if she understood more than she let on. Then she whispered, "He used to sleep with a stuffed dinosaur. Wouldn't go anywhere without it." I smiled, bitter and soft. "I remember." "We didn't raise him like this, Harold." "No," I said, "but we showed him where the line was. He just decided to step over it." Alan called on the 4th morning. "Got something for you," he said. He transferred the funds into 3 different accounts, one offshore, one in a startup investment portfolio, and one in his girlfriend's name. "Girlfriend?" "Yeah, realtor, Sandra McNeil. She's been on and off his radar for a while. Looks like he used some of the cash to help her close a commercial deal. I've got transaction logs. Also, he's planning something." "What kind of something?" "Expansion. New house, bigger property, early retirement plan. I think he's planning to flip everything within 6 months and walk away clean." I leaned back in my chair, my hand resting on the edge of the desk. "He thinks I'm dead weight." Alan was quiet. "Send everything to the secure drive." "It's already there." "Thanks, Alan." "One more thing," he added. "He doesn't know you know." "Good." Back at home, I took the next step. I updated my will, not to punish, but to protect. Removed Jacob entirely. Left everything to Ellen, with a clause that passed control to a local foundation if she passed before me. The foundation already existed. I had set it up years ago for community apprenticeships, but now it had a new purpose. A legacy that couldn't be bought, only built. I moved the rest of our savings into an account Jacob didn't know existed, sold off the stocks, liquidated assets he thought he had access to. One by one, the pillars of his assumed future came down, quietly, invisibly. And still, I said nothing. Let him live in the comfort of his illusion. Let him smile over Sunday brunches with Sandra and dream about the house in the hills. Let him forget that a mechanic always knows how to take something apart without leaving a trace. A week later, Jacob showed up again. No warning, no call. Just the sound of his car door slamming in the driveway, and that hurried knock he always used. 3 quick taps, like he was in charge of the world's tempo. I opened the door. He smiled. "Hey, Dad, just checking in." I stepped aside. "Come in." Ellen looked up from her knitting. "Coffee's still warm." Jacob walked in like it was still his house, like nothing had shifted, like nothing had been stolen. He leaned on the kitchen counter, eyeing the familiar space, the small signs of change, my walking stick by the door, the locked drawer on the desk. "How's the back?" he asked. "Healing," I said, "slower than I'd like." He nodded, then tilted his head with fake concern. "Well, you're not getting any younger." I didn't bite. He reached for an apple from the bowl and took a bite without asking. "So I was thinking," he said, talking between chews. "If you and Mom ever want to downsize, move somewhere easier to manage, I could help sell the place. Good market right now." I looked him dead in the eye. This house isn't going anywhere. His smile twitched. "Just thinking long term. Big houses, they get lonely." Ellen stood up then. "We're not lonely." That shut him up, for a second. He changed the subject. Talked about work, about how the market was changing, how he was considering launching his own firm. "I've got contacts now," he said. "People who trust me." I thought about the footage. Him cracking the safe, stuffing bills into his designer duffel bag like it was his weekly allowance. "Trust is a funny thing," I said. "Easy to lose, hard to earn." He didn't flinch, just gave a lazy shrug. "People move on." "Yes," I said quietly. "They do." He left 10 minutes later, humming as he walked to his car, waving like everything was still intact. But it wasn't. Not anymore. 2 days later, I made another call. This one wasn't to Alan. This one was to my old friend Marcus Flint. Retired lawyer, quiet bulldog in a cardigan. The kind of man who never raised his voice but never lost a case. I met him for coffee at the corner diner. "I need it done quietly," I said. "No letters. No noise, just action." He sipped his black coffee. "You want the trust sealed off?" "Yes, locked, irrevocable." "Assets?" "All moved." "Contingency?" "Already drafted." He nodded. "You planning to tell him?" "No, he'll find out when it hurts the most." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want to do it this way?" I looked at the reflection in my cup, the lines on my face, the man I had become. "No, but I have to." Weeks passed. The air changed, got colder. Jacob stopped calling. Maybe he sensed the shift. Or maybe he was just busy chasing dreams built on money that wasn't his. Ellen and I fell into a quiet routine. Books in the evening, tea in the morning. Walks around the yard. We didn't talk about what was coming. We didn't need to. One morning I got a call from Alan. "Thought you'd want to know." He made a down payment on a property in New Haven. Commercial. Big risk. He's gambling. "With my money." Alan paused. "Not anymore." I leaned back, smiled. He'd used the wrong account. The account I'd already drained. He was about to find out the hard way. That evening, Ellen found me in the garage, polishing an old wrench that hadn't seen sunlight in 10 years. She leaned against the door frame. "He called." I turned. "What did he say?" "He didn't leave a message, but he called 3 times." I nodded. "It's starting." She walked over, placed her hand on mine. "Are you ready for what comes next?" I've been ready since the moment he turned that handle on the safe. The next morning, Jacob showed up again. This time, no oranges, no small talk. He looked pale, panicked. Eyes darting like a man who just realized the ground beneath him was paper thin. "What's going on?" he demanded, the door barely shut behind him. "Did you move something?" "Why are my accounts frozen?" I didn't answer, just motioned toward the living room. He followed, pacing. "I'm serious, Dad. The trust is locked." "The bank won't tell me anything. My deal's falling apart. What did you do?" Ellen sat calmly, watching him like a stranger. I leaned forward. "You broke into my house," I said. "You opened my safe. You stole from your own blood." He froze. "What?" "You heard me." He laughed, nervous. "What are you talking about?" I stood up, walked to the TV, plugged in the USB, pressed play. There he was. Jacob, in full clarity, cracking the safe. The silence in the room was thick. When the video ended, I turned back to him. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Jacob stared, hollow. "You filmed me?" I protected myself. He sank onto the couch, hands trembling. "Dad, I needed it. I was drowning. I thought you'd be gone longer. I was going to put it back." "No," I said. "You weren't." He looked up at me, desperate, small. "What now?" I picked up a folder from the table, dropped it in his lap. Inside were legal documents. He flipped through, his name removed from every asset, every share, every clause. "This is theft," he whispered. "No," I said. "This is consequence." Jacob didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the papers, blinking like they might rearrange themselves into something more forgiving, as if denial could bend ink and intent. "I'm your son," he finally whispered. I sat back down. "And you chose to be a thief." His lip quivered. "You don't understand what it's like out there. Everything costs more. Nothing's guaranteed. You and Mom had it easier." Ellen stiffened beside me. "We had nothing," she said coldly. "We built everything with blistered hands and sleepless nights." Jacob scoffed, but it sounded hollow. "You think pride pays bills?" "No," I said, "but character does. And you spent yours like loose change." He stood up, clutching the folder like it might still protect him. "This isn't over." "Yes," I said, "it is." He stared at me, eyes red, fists clenched, but then something flickered in his face. Fear, real, unfiltered fear. He turned and stormed out. I didn't watch him leave. I listened to the engine roar, the tires screech, and then silence. Ellen spoke first. "He'll come back." I nodded. "And when he does, I'll be ready." For a while, I thought that was it. But betrayal doesn't die quietly. A week later, the letters started coming. Formal envelopes, legal stamps, one after the other. Jacob was contesting the trust, claiming diminished capacity, saying I'd been manipulated, that someone had forged documents. He was grasping, drowning, and trying to pull us down with him. I took them all to Marcus. He read through the stack without a word. Then he looked up. "You want to fight?" I shook my head. "I want to win." "Then don't swing first. Let him exhaust himself. Let him show the courts who he really is." The court date came quicker than I expected. Jacob showed up in a tailored suit and crocodile tears. Told the judge he was just looking out for his aging parents. That I was slipping, confused, unstable. He said the cameras were manipulated, that the trust documents were forged, that I was coerced by outside influence. Then they asked me to speak. I stood up, slowly, walked to the front, looked every person in the room in the eye. "My son," I began, "broke into my home while I was in the hospital. He stole from my safe." And then he smiled in my face like nothing happened. Gasps echoed. One juror leaned forward. I continued. I didn't act out of confusion. I acted out of clarity. Because betrayal doesn't get softer with age. It cuts deeper. Then I played the video. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Jacob's voice, muttering to himself as he pulled out stacks of money and stuffed them into his bag. When it ended, I turned to him. "You didn't just steal money. You stole trust, and that you can't buy back." The ruling was swift. The trust stood. The documents were upheld. Jacob's claims were dismissed. And when the court fees were tallied, he owed more than he had left in his account. That's when the calls started. From banks. From investors. From people who no longer wanted to be associated with his name. One afternoon I found Ellen standing in the garden, watching the wind push through the trees. She didn't turn as I approached. "He's on the news," she said quietly. I already knew. I'd seen the segment. Former real estate advisor under fire for alleged inheritance fraud. I stood beside her. He did it to himself. "I know," she said, "but it still hurts." I wrapped my arm around her. "We didn't lose him today. We lost him the moment he opened that safe." That night, I sat at my desk, opened a blank page, and I wrote Jacob a letter. Not out of bitterness, not even out of anger, just closure. "You chose shortcuts," I wrote. "You thought love was unconditional and consequences were optional. You were wrong. I hope one day you understand the cost, not the money, the silence." I folded the paper, slid it into an envelope, and burned it in the fireplace. Weeks passed. Jacob went silent. No more letters, no more threats, just nothing. It should have felt like peace, but it didn't. Because silence from a man like him, that's not surrender, that's strategy. One evening, I noticed the motion light on the side of the garage flicker on. I stepped out with my flashlight, slow and quiet. Nothing. Just the wind, the gravel crunching beneath my slippers. But I saw it the next morning, footprints in the dirt near the side gate, fresh. He'd been back, watching, waiting, not for reconciliation, not for remorse, for weakness. And he'd find none. I started reinforcing everything. New locks, reinforced windows, updated cameras. I even added a second safe. Empty, deliberately. Let him find it. Let him think he'd won again. It was bait. Because this time, if he came back, I wanted him to dig his own grave with both hands. Ellen was quiet during this stretch. She didn't ask questions. She just brought me coffee, like always, rubbed my shoulders, slept a little closer than usual. One night I found her in the study holding an old photo, Jacob at 13, holding up a science fair trophy, grinning like he'd just discovered joy. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I do," I said. "He wanted more than what we gave him, and he thought the fastest path was through us." She looked up. "Do you think he'll come back?" I nodded. "Yes, but not as a son." And he did. 2 weeks later, middle of the night. I was already awake, old habits. I heard the gate click. Then the side door creak. I didn't move, just watched the monitor. He wore gloves this time, moved slower. Straight to the decoy safe. He cracked it like he'd done it 100 times. Too easy. Then came the confusion. He reached in, expecting cash. Found a note instead. 4 words, handwritten. "Smile," for the camera. He froze. Looked straight up. The red light blinked. I stepped outside, shotgun cradled, not loaded, just loud. He bolted through the back door and vanished into the dark. Coward. The next day, I filed the footage. Didn't press charges. Didn't make a call. Because this wasn't about jail. It was about shame. It was about letting him know I see you now. Not as a child. Not as family. But as a man who mistook mercy for weakness. Later that week, Ellen placed a box on my desk. Inside, birthday cards Jacob had made as a kid. Crayon drawings. Sloppy handwriting. Love spelled love. I closed the lid slowly. Some memories are best kept behind glass. Not burned. Not shredded. Just sealed. Not for him. For us. To remember what we tried to raise before it all went dark. That night, I slept like a man who had finally locked every door, inside and out. The next Sunday, Pastor Ellison dropped by after service. He was an old friend. Knew me back when my hands could still twist an engine block without needing aspirin afterward. He sat with me on the porch, sipping iced tea Ellen had brought out in those glasses with the faded sunflowers on them. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I gave a half smile. "Trying it out." Silence. He nodded like he knew there was more. "I heard about Jacob," he said finally. I didn't flinch. "From who?" "Doesn't matter. Small town." I stared out across the yard. The oak trees swayed like they weren't listening, but they always were. "I raised a son who knew better," I said, "but he chose worse. Sometimes we plant seeds and forget the soil has its own plans." I chuckled dryly. "That sounds like something a man with no broken windows would say." He leaned forward. "I'm not here to preach. I'm here because a good man's been sitting in the dark too long." I didn't answer. Not right away. Because part of me wanted to stay there, in the dark, where I could think clearly, where the betrayal didn't scream as loud. The next week, I went to the bank. Not to withdraw. To transfer. Every account. Every property deed. Every document I once kept in that safe now had a new home. A trust. Irrevocable. Untouchable. Jacob couldn't touch what no longer technically belonged to me, and I didn't need to die for him to find that out. I gave Ellen the binder. "Everything's here," I said. "If anything ever happens." "Nothing's going to happen," she interrupted gently. I smiled. "But if it does, I want you protected. I want this house protected." She ran her fingers over the leather cover. "It's like armor." "No," I said. "It's the wall, the last one." 3 days later, I received a letter. Handwritten. From Jacob. No return address. It read, "You think you're clever. You think I won't fight back. But you're just an old man with cameras and trust issues. You forget I'm your blood." I folded it slowly. Set it aside. Didn't reply. He wanted a reaction, an explosion, another chance to twist the knife. But I had already decided. The final blow would be mine. On my terms. A few weeks passed. No word from Jacob. No sudden visits. No apologies. No more fake concern wrapped in smiles. Just silence. The kind that buzzes in your ear when you lie awake at 3 a.m., wondering how your own blood became the kind of man who could rob you blind and still sleep soundly. But I didn't sit idle. I called a locksmith, had the entire house rekeyed, every door, every shed, every lock. Even the safe, though I hadn't put a thing back in it since. The cameras? Upgraded. I replaced every single one with models that had cloud backups and motion alerts that pinged straight to my phone. If Jacob so much as stepped on the porch, I'd know before he knocked. But I wasn't just playing defense. I was building my endgame. One morning, Ellen found me in the study. I had the old family photo albums out, those heavy leather-bound ones that smelled like dust and faded ink. "What are you doing?" she asked, sitting beside me. "Picking memories," I said. "For?" "For the lawyer." She frowned. "Harold, I'm putting together a record, a legacy, something real, not just money and deeds. I want it all in the trust, stories, pictures, my voice even." She touched my hand. "You think Jacob will try to fight this?" I looked at her. Hard. He already has. I recorded everything. Not just documents, not just footage, my voice, my story, all of it. I sat down one afternoon, turned on the mic and said, "My name is Harold Mercer. I was born in 1951. I loved machines more than people for most of my life. Then I met Ellen. Then we had Jacob. And somewhere along the line, the world changed. Or maybe we did. But I want whoever finds this to know there's a difference between surviving and surrendering. And I never surrendered. One night, Ellen and I had dinner on the porch. The cicadas were screaming like they knew something was coming. She passed me a bowl of green beans. "Do you ever think he'll come back?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "He will." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I haven't reacted yet. And Jacob's the kind of man who can't stand not knowing if he got away with something." She stared out into the dark. "So, we wait." I nodded. "And we prepare." The next week it happened. Middle of the night. Motion alert on my phone. Garage camera. I didn't panic. Didn't wake Ellen. I just got up, pulled on my slippers, and checked the feed. Jacob. Hooded. Hands gloved. Trying the side door. Only this time, it didn't open. He looked up, right at the camera, for just a second. Then he turned and disappeared back into the dark. No forced entry. No damage. Just a message. "I saw you. You saw me. Let's see who blinks first." But I didn't blink. I called my lawyer the next morning. "Activate the clause," I said. "You sure?" he asked. "Positive. Clause 14B. We'd written it months ago. If Jacob attempted to access the property again, unauthorized, at night, with signs of intent, the trust would go into full lock mode. No access to funds. No chance to contest. Everything would be locked until my death, and then passed directly to Ellen and the community foundation I'd partnered with. We'd even named it after my father, the Mercer Endowment for Honest Trades. Jacob wouldn't get a penny. Not now. Not later. Ellen didn't ask questions when I told her the clause had been triggered. She just nodded slowly and said, "So it's done then?" "Not yet," I said. "But the walls are closing in." 2 days later, we got a letter. Jacob's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a card. The kind you'd buy from a drugstore, white with gold trim. On the front it said, "Thinking of you." Inside, in rushed pen, "Glad to hear you're up and around again. Let's grab lunch soon. Talk about the future. Love, Jacob." No apology, no reference to what he'd done, no acknowledgement of the silent war between us. Just another mask. I didn't reply. But I took the card and tucked it into the folder with the camera footage, let it join the rest of the evidence. Weeks turned into a month. And then Jacob tried again. This time he didn't come in person. He sent a woman. Late 30s, blazer too clean, smile too rehearsed. Said she was from a local property developer. "We're acquiring homes in the area for a new eco-living project. Your house sits in a very desirable corner, Mr. Mercer." I smiled politely. "Is that so?" She nodded, pulling out a folder. "We'd be willing to offer over market value, cash, if needed, fast close." I leaned back. "You said we. Who's we, exactly?" She blinked. "The firm is backed by several private investors." "Like my son?" I said, watching her face. She hesitated, a second too long. Then she smiled again. "I'm afraid I don't know your family, sir." I stood up. "This meeting is over." That night, I called my lawyer again. "I want to move up the transfer." "You're sure?" "Yes. The house, the land, everything. Put it into the foundation. Now." He sighed. "All right, Harold, but once we do this, there's no going back. Not even for you." "I know," I said. "That's the point." The next few weeks were filled with paperwork. Signatures. Notarized transfers. Quiet phone calls and slow nods. Ellen watched it all with calm, steady eyes. "You're really doing this," she said one morning as we signed the last batch. "I am," I said. "He made it clear what he values. I'm just making sure he can't touch it again." And then came the dinner. It was Jacob's idea. He called Ellen, not me. Said he wanted to reconnect. Said he was sorry if he'd been distant. Ellen asked if I wanted to cancel. I shook my head. "No," I said. "Let's have dinner." "Why?" "Because some lessons only land face to face." He showed up with wine and charm. Wore a sweater like he was still our golden boy from high school. Gave Ellen a kiss on the cheek. Clapped me on the back and said, "Glad to see you upright, Dad." We sat at the table. Chicken, potatoes, bread. He talked. We listened. And when dessert came, I cleared my throat. "There's something you should know, Jacob." He froze. Fork halfway to his mouth. "I transferred the house," I said. "The land, the money, everything." His hand lowered slowly. "To who?" he asked. "To someone who won't try to steal it when my back is turned." His face twitched. Just a flicker. "You're joking." "I'm not." "And the safe," he started. I cut him off. "Had cameras on it, every angle, every second." He went quiet. Ellen didn't say a word. I leaned in, calm, precise. You thought I fell, that I was weak, that I wouldn't know. But I knew. And I waited. His eyes narrowed. "You can't do this." I already did. He pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping loud against the tile. "This is insane," he muttered. "You're throwing away your legacy over a misunderstanding." Ellen looked at him then, really looked. "A misunderstanding?" she said quietly. "Jacob, we saw the footage." He flinched. "You broke into our home," she continued. "You opened a safe that you weren't supposed to even know existed. You emptied it, and then you walked back in here with oranges and smiles." Jacob's jaw clenched. "You think I wanted to do that? You think I had a choice?" "There's always a choice," I said. He laughed bitterly. "Easy for you to say." You've never had to worry about mortgage payments, daycare, a wife who's one bad month from leaving. Don't you dare, I said, my voice dropping. He looked up, startled. Don't you dare make your betrayal my fault. Silence stretched across the table. Finally, Jacob stood fully. I should have known you'd pull something like this, he said. You were always better at making moves behind people's backs. You learned from the best, I said, folding my napkin and placing it gently beside my plate. He stormed out, didn't even take the wine he brought. Ellen exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. That went about as well as expected. It wasn't for him, I said. It was for us, so there's no doubt, so he can't twist the story later. She nodded. What now? Now, I said, we wait. It didn't take long. A week later, we got a formal letter from a lawyer. Jacob was contesting the will, trying to prove I wasn't of sound mind when I transferred the assets. That I'd been coerced, manipulated. The gall of it was almost impressive. I sent a single reply. 3 pages of documentation. Footage timestamps, doctor's evaluations, legal affidavits, and a personal letter, handwritten by me. Jacob, you had a chance to ask, a chance to explain, a chance to be honest. You chose theft instead. This isn't about punishment. It's about boundaries. You crossed them. Now you live with a line that was drawn. This will be the last correspondence. Harold. That letter shut it down. His lawyer backed off once he realized there was no loophole, no angle. I'd done it all by the book. Slow, quiet, legal. The cameras had been installed after the first time Jacob asked about helping us downsize. Something in his tone had felt off, like he wasn't talking about our needs, but about his future. So I'd prepared. And when the fall came, when I slipped off that ladder and cracked my rib, I realized just how right I'd been to prepare. Ellen and I didn't talk much about it after that. There was nothing left to say. The house was ours, secured by the foundation. The money was distributed safely, the documents sealed and witnessed, and Jacob disappeared. No more cards, no more visits. I still think about him sometimes. Still wonder if he ever looks in the mirror and sees the moment he stopped being a son and became a stranger. But I don't dwell, because what I built, brick by brick, day by day, is still here. And the man who tried to steal it? He's not. I didn't expect the letter. It came 3 months later, no return address, just my name in tight, slanted handwriting that I recognized immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Dad, you win. You always win. I don't even know what I expected. I thought maybe I'd get ahead for once. Maybe make up for all the times I felt like the outsider in my own family. But all I did was prove you right about me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I wouldn't believe it even if you offered it. I just wanted to let you know I'm leaving. For real this time. Not one of those, I just need space exits. I'm done. Don't look for me. I'm sorry. Jacob. I read it twice. Then folded it and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I didn't tell Ellen. Not right away. She still had hope in her chest. Still clung to the idea that time could fix what betrayal had shattered. Me? I was done hoping. We started seeing a lot more of the neighborhood kids. I began volunteering at the local garage, showing teens how to change oil, replace filters, patch tires. Nothing fancy. Just tools, grease, and earned pride. There was a boy, Micah, about 17, wiry and curious. Asked good questions, watched every movement like it mattered. One day, I caught him staring at the old truck I kept under the tarp out back. That yours? He asked. Since 1982, I said. Built her up myself. She's a little rusty now. Micah grinned. Can we fix it? It hit me then. Not regret, not loss, but clarity. The future I wanted with my son was never about inheritance or bloodline. It was about building something that mattered and passing it on to someone who'd treat it right. One morning, Ellen handed me a box. "What's this?" "Found it in the closet," she said. "You should look." Inside was a photo album, one I hadn't seen in years. Me and Jacob, elbow deep in engine parts. His first bike. His first win at the science fair. The graduation shot with me half smiling, and him looking off to the side like he already had somewhere else to be. I sat with that album for a long time. Then I closed it, slid it back in the box, and taped the lid shut. The final piece of the plan came together slowly, like threading a needle through steel. I had the property restructured under a legacy trust. Not just for family, for the town. A small scholarship fund, a workshop program, a community grant pool for local trades. I named it after my father, Thomas Mercer, a man who'd taught me how to use a wrench and a word like they both had weight. Ellen was the witness. The lawyer smiled when she signed. "You're sure?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm not leaving a kingdom to be fought over. I'm leaving a workshop to be built in." We never heard from Jacob again. Not a call, not an email, just silence. And maybe that was the real revenge. Not rage, not confrontation, but removing the audience, closing the chapter, leaving him to his choices while we wrote something new. Years passed. My hands got shakier, Ellen moved slower, but the house stayed warm, the laughter in the garage stayed loud, and the safe? It stayed empty. Just a hollow shell and a locked cabinet. Its only job now was to remind me of what doesn't matter. The real valuables weren't ever behind that steel door. They were beside me every morning, or under the hood of an old Chevy with a kid asking why spark plugs mattered, or in a quiet letter I never answered. I'm not a perfect man, but I protected what mattered. And when the time came to choose between blood and legacy, I chose legacy. And that's a decision I'll never regret. The letters came one at a time. First from a lawyer in Houston, then a credit union in New Mexico, then finally an envelope with no return address. All of them asking some version of the same question. Did you co-sign for Jacob Mercer on this loan? No. That was the short answer. The long one? That took a little more explaining. Turns out, when you burn bridges behind you, sometimes the only light left is from the fire. Jacob had left town, but he hadn't left his habits, the spending, the charming of lenders, the signature forging, his need to always look like the man in control, even when everything under the surface was slipping. He'd forged my name at least twice, maybe more. But this time he'd underestimated the one thing I hadn't told anyone outside my lawyer, the power of legal distance. Everything of value had been pulled from my name months earlier. Even the truck. I don't know why it still stings, I told Ellen one night as we sat out, back watching the sky fold into orange. Because he's still your son, she said gently. Is he? I asked, and she didn't answer. That was answer enough. We started hearing things from neighbors. A friend of a friend saw him working at a resort upstate. Someone else claimed he'd been selling insurance, then went off-grid again. It was always vague, a shadow behind glass, never close enough to touch. Sometimes I wondered if that was by design. Maybe he knew how it would feel to walk back into our lives and see the lights still on, the garden tended, the workshop full of voices, not his. Maybe he wasn't avoiding punishment. Maybe he was avoiding proof that we were fine without him. I don't know if I'd call what I felt peace, but it was something like it. A calmness that didn't need answers. A quiet that wasn't empty. Ellen took up painting again, watercolors mostly. Soft skies, old trees. She made our front hallway look like a memory you could walk into. I went fishing. Not for the fish, mind you. I never had much luck. But for the stillness. For the ritual. Cast. Wait. Breathe. Just like in the garage. Just like in life. One morning, Micah came by with a sheet of paper in his hand. I got in, he said, eyes wide. To what? The trade school in Tallahassee. Full ride. I didn't realize I'd started tearing up until he stepped back and said, "You okay, Mr. Mercer?" I laughed, wiped my face with my sleeve. "Just proud of you is all." He looked down at the letter again. "I put your name down, for the reference." I nodded. Then I told him about Jacob. All of it. I don't know why. Maybe because he'd earned it. Maybe because he reminded me of a version of my son that once was. Or maybe I just needed someone younger to hear the story, so it didn't disappear with me. He listened the whole time, quiet, serious. At the end, he said, "You didn't get the son you deserved." I shook my head. "No," I said, "but maybe I got the future I earned." Some nights, I dream of the safe. Still sitting in the corner of the office, empty as a tin can, its door ajar like a mouth that forgot how to close. In the dream, I see Jacob standing over it, hand outstretched, unsure if he's stealing or reaching for something that might bring him back. And I just watch. Not angry, not broken, just watching. Because in the end, you can't make someone return. You can only make sure you're not destroyed waiting for them. It was a Tuesday when the letter came. Not from Jacob. Not directly. It was from a woman named Claire. Typed neatly, signed with a soft swirl of ink. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Mercer," it began. "My name is Claire Addison. I'm reaching out because your son Jacob has listed me as an emergency contact on a medical intake form." I froze. She continued. "He was brought into the clinic last week. Dehydration, minor injuries. Seems he's been living rough. No ID, no insurance. He mentioned your name, but wouldn't let us contact you directly. Said you wouldn't want to hear from him." She was right. We didn't. But that didn't stop Ellen from holding the letter like it might shatter in her hands. "He's not well," she whispered. "No," I said. "And he's alone." I didn't reply. Because she was right, too. That night I sat on the porch with a glass of water and watched the trees shift in the wind. The temptation was there. Send something. Money. A note. Anything to prove I wasn't made of stone. But then I remembered what Ellen said the day we watched the camera footage. He took the last thing we thought was safe. And that wasn't just about the cash. It was about belief. About trust. About the tiny, fragile line between love and manipulation. I didn't owe him closure. I owed myself peace. Months passed. Then a year. Jacob never came back. We never called. The lawyer said he'd accessed none of the trust, because he couldn't. The language was clear. Subject to character review and caregiver status. Legal code for only if you haven't already burned every bridge. Micah came back one weekend in spring. He'd gotten an apprenticeship with a classic car restoration outfit in Florida. Big smile, stronger handshake. He brought Ellen a little watercolor set from a local art store. And for me, a wrench. Old, heavy American steel. "I found it at a swap meet," he grinned. "Thought of you." I held it in my hand. Familiar weight, honest metal. I thought of all the things I had passed down without knowing. Patience, craft, the power of silence. He didn't carry my name. But somehow, he carried something better. The house stayed quiet, mostly. Just the hum of old walls and the soft chatter of radio on rainy days. Ellen painted a portrait of the safe. Can you believe that? The damn safe. She titled it, "Things We Thought We Owned." It hung in the hallway right above the USB drive box. Sometimes people asked what it meant. We just smiled. I never did change the locks. Didn't need to. Jacob was never coming back. And if he ever did? Well, let's just say the camera still worked. But more importantly, so did I. Not for revenge. Not anymore. But for meaning. For a life that didn't shrink around a betrayal. For days that opened, instead of closing. For trust, not given blindly, but earned patiently. For the kind of silence that doesn't scream, but heals. It was nearly 5 years later when the phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. A city I hadn't thought about in decades. "Mr. Mercer?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes. My name's Tanya. I'm a social worker based out of Baton Rouge. I'm sorry to call out of the blue, but I believe we've had some contact indirectly before. Years ago, a woman named Claire sent you a letter regarding your son Jacob." I didn't speak. She continued gently. "I wanted to inform you, Jacob Mercer passed away last week. Exposure. He was living on the street, no known residence. We pieced together fragments of his ID from a shelter form and traced his name to some older medical paperwork. I felt something then, but not what I expected. Not rage. Not grief. Just the final closing of a door that had been rotting on its hinges for years." Tanya paused, maybe waiting for emotion. I gave her none. "Was there anything left?" I asked. "Only a small notebook," she said, "and a pawned ring receipt. Nothing of value." I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Thank you for letting me know. If you'd like us to send—" "No, that won't be necessary." I hung up. Then I sat in my chair by the window, watched the rain slide down the glass. Later that evening, I told Ellen. She didn't cry. She didn't speak for a long time. Just sat there holding her tea like it might spill the moment she loosened her grip. When she did speak, it was just one word. "Okay." That night, she pulled out an old photo of Jacob, back when he still had soft eyes and messy hair, and believed the world was worth impressing. She slipped it into the drawer. Not the one with the USB drive. Not the one with the will. Just a quiet drawer by the bed. And we went to sleep. A week later, Micah came by. He brought fresh peaches and a smile that never needed to hide anything. "I brought you something," he said, pulling out a carved wooden box. "Made it myself." Inside was a hand-engraved plaque. "What's earned is never stolen. What's stolen is never kept." I looked up at him. "You always this poetic?" He laughed. "I learned from the best. I keep that box on my workbench, right next to my tools. Not because I need a reminder of what happened, but because it reminds me what didn't break. Not me. Not Ellen. Not the future we chose to build anyway. The world doesn't hand you peace. Sometimes it hands you betrayal wrapped in blood. But if you stay quiet long enough, if you sit still and listen, you'll hear something louder than revenge. You'll hear peace choosing you back. And when it does, you won't need a camera. You'll already know. They lost the moment you stopped needing them to lose. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of the story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching to the end.